Tonight, the King 5 investigators expose secret files locked up inside one of the country's most trusted youth organizations, the Boy Scouts of America. For decades, the group has kept thousands of files on scout leaders who are alleged child molesters. King 5's Susannah Frame is one of the first journalists in the country to obtain some of those files, and she joins us now with the story.
Lori, the original idea behind keeping these files was actually a good one. The Boy Scouts thought, let's carefully document scout leaders suspected of abusing children. That way we can get them out of the program and make sure they never get back in. But critics say the Scouts were more interested in protecting their reputation than their Scouts. For years, the Boy Scouts of America fought hard to keep you from seeing these. They're so-called perversion files, meticulous records on thousands of scout leaders accused of child molestation going back decades. A blacklist of sorts intended to kick suspected pedophiles out of scouting and to keep them out. We've obtained 50 of these files, all stemming from cases across Washington state, from Bellingham to Kennewick to Spokane in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. A typical file looks like this. Records on Scoutmaster Richard Dilley from Burien. The Scouts banned him for life in 1990 after being convicted of molesting 2 boys in his troop for years. It happened at Scout camps and at his apartment. And this file on Assistant Scoutmaster Charles Grew of Lake Stevens. He got on the blacklist in 1988 after convictions for sex crimes against several children. One former Boy Scout testified Grew molested him in a Scout camp swimming pool. As the years rolled on, top Scout officials at their headquarters in Texas had amassed enough files to know this wasn't a fluke. We're not talking about a few isolated cases. Their own files showed sex abuse inside scouting was rampant across the country in every state, including Washington.
Files grew from tens to hundreds to thousands, and they ended up having a body of knowledge probably unlike any other youth-serving institution in the United States, demonstrating that pedophiles were infiltrating their ranks.
Seattle attorney Mike Fow has represented dozens of Scouts in abuse cases. He says by the 60s it was clear scouting was a magnet for pedophiles. But instead of alerting parents, volunteers, and the public to be aware, he says the Scouts circled the wagons to protect the Boy Scout brand.
The Boy Scouts of America had a institutional knowledge that pedophiles were infiltrating their ranks, were molesting their scouts, and they knew about it long before they took appropriate or even arguably appropriate measures to protect kids.
The Boy Scouts say protecting kids was exactly why the files were confidential.
For more than 100 years, Scouting has served as a mentor to youth.
Former top Scouting executive Robert Mazuka explained the strategy on a YouTube video.
We have kept these files confidential because we believe victims deserve protection and that confidentiality encourages prompt reporting of questionable behavior. It removes the fear of retribution and ensures victims and their families the privacy that they deserve.
Critics say the Scouts' actions and inactions are following right in the footsteps of the Catholic Church. 10 years after that scandal broke.
Keeping information secret, focusing on protecting brand or reputation over protecting children, and not placing the protection of kids first. I think those are all similarities between the Catholic Church scandal and what's going on with the Boy Scouts of America now.
Now, in the 1990s, the Scouts did institute stronger policies to protect their kids. They made background checks mandatory, and 2 years ago, they created a policy that all suspected abuse has to be reported to law enforcement. The question tonight is, why didn't they institute some of these measures earlier in the game?
Exactly. It seems to be so huge, and you have more for us tomorrow coming up.
Right. Tomorrow, we have a heartbreaking story. 2 brothers, twins, who were abused by a Scoutmaster 25 years ago. And tomorrow they're going to speak out publicly for the first time about the abuse and about their reaction to these files. And, you mentioned that this is a big situation, right. Massive amounts of files. I want to make it clear that there are far more than 50 abuse cases in Washington state. We just have a sampling of them, and I think we're going to be able to obtain more files from this state and across the country in the weeks and months to come.
All right. Susannah, thank you.
Tonight, more revelations about the secret files of the Boy Scouts. For nearly 100 years, top scouting officials were kicking suspected child molesters out of their ranks and keeping confidential files about it. Tonight, King 5 investigator Susannah Frame speaks with two brothers who say they were abused by a scout leader and that the organization should have done more to protect them.
To me, he was a trusted scout leader. And if he was telling me that no one would believe me, it made me feel exactly like that this is this trusted man telling me that no one's going to believe me.
This week, Lance and Orrin Myers sat down with me to say they're done keeping secrets.
I mean, just breaking the silence is breaking the chain, is coming forward. Hopefully it'll help.
For the first time ever, they're speaking publicly about the repeated rapes they endured at the hands of this man, a scoutmaster in Seattle. For 25 years, they said nothing until now.
So it was a secret that he wanted to make sure stayed that way.
Yes, and that's why I'm speaking out.
Yeah.
It's not a secret anymore.
As teenagers in the mid-'80s, the Myers brothers, who are twins, started attending scout meetings. At first, it was great. The leader made them feel special.
He was a very strong male role model that I think any young man would look up to.
But the attention turned ugly and illegal. They say the scoutmaster molested them over and over at parks and at his apartment, and he used threats to keep the boys quiet.
I could get in trouble for what I was doing, he would lose all respect for me.
If you talk.
Mm-hmm.
So they kept their mouths shut, thinking they were the only ones. Neither one even knew his twin had suffered the same abuse until last year, at the age of 40.
And that was probably the saddest day of my life.
Just devastated.
We now know the Myers twins were not alone. At Boy Scout headquarters in Texas, top Scout executives had compiled thousands of files known as perversion files on Scout leaders suspected of molesting kids for decades. One file for each leader they'd kicked out of the program, a record to make sure the abusers stayed out of Scouting for good. We've obtained 50 of these, all files from Washington State. They detail cases such as a scoutmaster from Spokane accused of molesting 4 boys in his troop in the 1970s. A scout leader from Belfair who allegedly molested a boy at a scout camp in 1990. That child ended up in a psychiatric ward. And a 1986 case in Vancouver, an assistant scoutmaster convicted of raping a child on a scout-sanctioned camping trip.
All this time, I thought it was just me out there, and it turns out it was a whole lot of other boys too that had the same thing happen to them, and it's just really hard to understand how something like that could happen. I wish it was only me, but it wasn't.
The Scouts say they kept the files and kept them confidential to protect the kids. The Myers brothers say they should have done a lot more, a lot sooner, such as alerting families and volunteers to be aware that pedophiles were targeting the Boy Scouts of America.
I'd ask you, who does that actually protect? It didn't protect me.
It makes me sick to my stomach to realize that they were not willing to come forward and protect these boys.
Orrin and Lance Myers are now suing the Boy Scouts of America for allegedly failing to protect them from the Scoutmaster. And that leader is believed to be living now in a state in the South. And because the Myers never came forward, those accusations have never been prosecuted or looked into by law enforcement. But he could be showing up in a courtroom through the civil process.
So they're going through with a civil
suit right now.
All right, Susannah, thank you. Tonight, the latest on the secret perversion files kept by the Boy Scouts of America.
The files contain information about suspected child molesters, Boy Scout leaders kicked out of the program to help keep Scouts safe.
But tonight, King 5 investigator Susannah Frame is the first journalist in the country to reveal dozens of men are listed in the files, not because they're suspected of abuse, but because they're gay.
3 and go.
members of the highly acclaimed Seattle Men's Chorus, like Joe Hopkins, the goal is to create music and acceptance, to be a bridge between gay and straight communities.
The mission is to build those bridges. It's to help ourselves and the audience.
Now Joe's using his voice in a different way.
It's part of my Scout training is that I have to speak up for something that's wrong. I mean, the Scouts taught me that if it's wrong, to speak out.
Joe Hopkins is a proud gay man and an equally proud Eagle Scout and former troop leader.
I love being a Boy Scout. I totally immersed myself in the program.
Now he feels betrayed by the very organization he believes helped him to become the good person he is today.
It sends shivers up my spine. I just can't believe it.
The secret's out. The Boy Scouts of America has quietly collected confidential files on gay men, Scout leaders, just like Joe, for decades.
It's unbelievable to actually see the proof that they've been doing this. And again, it's dated 1990. It's really sad.
These records are included in the Scout so-called perversion files. King 5 has obtained 50 of them that until recently were locked away at Scout headquarters in Texas. The purpose? Track unwanted leaders, kick them out, and make sure they stay out of Scouting. The majority of these files, thousands of them in all, are about suspected pedophiles. The Scouts wanted to make sure abusers were ousted from their program and kept away from their kids. But we found mixed in with these files about child molesters are men thrown out of Scouting for an entirely different reason: being gay.
Then to find out that within those files, they've picked men who were not molesters. Just because they're gay, they got added to the list. You know, that's outrageous.
To the Boy Scout organization, keeping files on gay people is simply in keeping with their long-standing policy that open or avowed homosexuals are not allowed to participate. That behavior would become a distraction to the mission of the Boy Scouts of America.
And now to have them turn around and say, well, you're automatically bad, it appalls me, it appalls everybody that I know.
What's exactly in the files? Those obtained by King show a Scoutmaster from Ellensburg kicked out in 1974 for a suspected moral problem. Top Scout execs wrote one word to explain why: homosexuality. 15 years later, in 1990, Scout leaders got wind a Seattle chapter chief seemed effeminate. They launched an investigation, then got proof he told a friend, "I'm gay." The next month, he was out. Joe hopes the Scouts will eventually come around and accept leaders like him. But until then, he'll be using his voice to try to make that happen.
I'm speaking out on behalf of myself and many other gay men who love the Scout program. So I'm just following on the tradition that I learned in Boy Scouts.
At this point, there's no evidence that the Boy Scouts have a file on Joe Hopkins. During his years of Scouting, no one knew he was gay, but do you know what? He was really nervous about doing this interview for many reasons. Right. But one of them was he's afraid he's going to get a letter saying, you know what? We saw you on King TV. You admitted you were gay. You're out for good.
Yes, he so loves the Scouts, so it's obvious.
Yeah, very dedicated to him.
All right. Thanks, Susannah.
Thanks, Susannah.